Yuki, all set? Okay. Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Stimson Center. My name is Brian Finlay. I'm the president and CEO here at Stimson. It's so nice to see so many familiar faces in the crowd. So earlier this year, we lost a remarkable colleague here at the Stimson Center, and we all in this room lost the Dean of East Asian Studies here in Washington. Throughout a remarkable career, initially in government, serving with the Navy, ultimately for many, many years with the U.S. Department of State, Alan Romberg described becoming enamored with not just Taiwanese, but East Asian society and politics in general. And it was to the great cause of ensuring peace, prosperity, and security in East Asia that Alan dedicated his career. As enduring, I think, as Alan's contributions were to that particular issue, I think that for many in this room, and I have heard from many of you in this room and know this to be true, were Alan's most remarkable contributions to mentorship to so many in Washington, inside and outside of the policy community, and indeed really around the world. He was a remarkable counselor and guide to many of us. As I say, I know this because I have heard from many of you in this room, many others outside this room, and I indeed benefited myself from Alan's wise counsel over so many years. I thank you all for coming to not just celebrate Alan's remarkable legacy, but also to launch this volume that my colleague Yuki Tatsumi and her co-director of the East Asia program, Yun-sun, have put together. I'm very grateful to the authors, some of whom you will hear from this afternoon as well, for writing and contributing to that volume as well. Nancy, I am particularly grateful for your presence here. Thank you so much for being here today. And I should also say a word of deep gratitude to TechCro for their enduring contribution and making Alan's contributions in turn possible for his many years here at Stimson. Ms. Shui, I wonder if I might invite you up to the podium. Ms. Shui is the Deputy Representative of TechCro here in Washington.
President Finlay, Director Tatsumi, Professor Christensen, Professor Goldstein, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It is my honor to speak at this event in memory of our old friend, Mr. Alan Romberg's contribution to the cross-strait relations, as well as U.S.-Taiwan relations. Alan was a good friend of Taiwan and a prominent China expert. Alan had dedicated himself in the past decades to enhancing mutual understanding and avoid miscalculation across the Taiwan Strait, no matter in his foreign service officer or his think tank fellow capacity. He made numerous trips to the region over the years, even after he got cancer and looked thinner and thinner each time we saw him. He still make efforts to collect information and get firsthand observation and direct communication. He has made tremendous legacy for us all, and Taiwan is particularly appreciative and grateful for his friendship and hard work. Personally, I also have some memorable working experience with Alan. He was one of the usual suspects of the cross-strait CBN delegation that Bonnie Glaser organized over the years, which I had the honor to be the ESCO officer for several times. And when I was the director of the political section of the TechCro, Alan was always the first few persons I would turn to whenever there's question regarding U.S.-China relation, U.S.-Taiwan relation, or cross-strait relations. And he was always very patient, responsive, and generous with his candid and insightful thoughts and opinion. So I would like to take this opportunity to express my heartfelt appreciation among his friends and former colleagues. I know today's topic is about Alan's contribution to cross-strait relations, yet since the three pairs of relationship correlate with one another, which is the US-Taiwan relation, the cross-strait relations, and US-China relations. I would also like to take this opportunity to mention some of the latest progress we have seen in US-Taiwan relations, which Alan would not miss in his China Leadership Monitor if he got to write another one. Earlier this year, the Taiwan Travel Act passed by both houses of the United Congress unanimously and signed by President Trump into law. Though we should avoid over-interpreting its implication, this piece of law indicates it's time to update some of the unreasonable guidelines. Furthermore, the approval by US government of marketing licenses for US defense contractors to participate in Taiwan's indigenous submarine program, though belated, but it is a major step forward for Taiwan to defend itself properly. And a very recent dedication of the new AIT compound in Taipei is not only a symbol of close cooperation and enduring friendship between the United States and Taiwan, it is also the renewed, strong commitment from US to Taiwan, as stated by Director King Moy during the dedication ceremony, that the United States is here to stay. However, it is important to note that all these are not results of playing certain kind of cards like some people claim, but it actually is a result of a very comprehensive and mutually beneficial partnership that United States and Taiwan has long time cultivated. And I can assure you that President Tsai and her government will continue and also is willing to continue her balanced and prudent cross-strait policy as long as the environment permits. And thank you very much for this opportunity to join you. I wish you have a very wonderful session later on. Thank you.
So I am going to invite three individuals that know Alan very, very well up to the dais now. If you all would come up, they will be led by my colleague here at Stimson, our mastermind behind this volume, and our host for this event, Yuki Tatsumi. Yuki, take it away.
On my microphone, is this on? Is it in green? Yeah? Okay. So great. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much. It's not on? Okay. I'll just project. How's that? Is it better? So, thank you again. Welcome. Like Brian said, I do this. I come to the podium in a lot of heavy heart. Like Brian said, Alan Romberg was really mentor to all of us, including myself. I was starting out as a research associate here at Stimson about 20 years ago when Alan joined after he retired from the senior advisor to the Navy. And throughout my career, he was always guided me. And also my co-director Yoon, who's sitting there in the back. She's being modest there, but she's my better half of this program. Both of us can say that we are really benefited so much from his mentoring over the years, and also his approach to research and writing. That he was always fact-based, no preconceived notion of any issues, and he always challenged us in terms of the way we look at issues, and we will never forget that as we carry our career forward. And I'm delighted to have Dr. Christensen right immediately to my left and Dr. Goldstein to my far left to join me in today's discussion, not only to celebrate, of course, primarily first and foremost, to celebrate this publication of Alan, but also take a little bit of time to reflect on Alan's contribution to the cross-strait relations, U.S.-Taiwan relations, and U.S.-China relations, and how those complicated issues have been so important to U.S.-Asia policy. Both gentlemen have joined Alan, or Alan was part of the study tour.
We all joined Steve.
Okay, so they all joined Steve on their annual trip to Beijing and Taipei to have a tractor dialogue with the officials on the current issues. And I remember this trip because I always do a processing of Alan's receipt after the travel. So every January, like a clockwork, I would handle this bundle of receipt for this trip. And they're both obviously not located in Washington, so I'm so grateful that Tom and Steve were able to, has agreed to take time off their summer schedule to come down here to join us for this one event. So let me start by asking either of you to talk about your reflection on Alan's work, your personal experience or memory of Alan's work. What was most notable about Alan that you can remember? So let me start with you, Steve.
I should come alive?
Yes, as I.
I can't resist saying that if Alan were alive today, he wouldn't be here. He would be deeply involved in the Singapore summit and the results of the Singapore summit. He would have already packed his bags or would be packing his bags to leave for Korea, and he'd be complaining already that he had to fly to Incheon rather than to Gimpo. So I have to say that. Having said that, it's not to diminish Alan's commitment to Taiwan. It's to emphasize the fact that Alan was a true Asianist, that he worked on Taiwan, and that's the experience that we had with him. But Alan was really one of the rare people who was comfortable talking about various parts, numerous parts of the Asian international system. And that made him very special. But today we're here to talk about the commentaries that he wrote and talk about the Stimson publication of those commentaries. And what I'd like to do is three things. Firstly, what I'd like to do is talk a bit about Alan's participation in the Taiwan workshop that Tom also took part in. Secondly, talk generally about these 12 years of commentaries that he wrote. And thirdly, try to think about today's developments in the Strait area in light of some of Alan's thoughts about it. I suspect that if he were to appear, that would be when he would appear, because I very rarely got it completely right for him, but I'll try my best. Oh, for you too, yeah? First point, the Harvard Taiwan Workshop. Harvard Taiwan Workshop is a group of academics, most of us from the Boston area, few of us actually at Harvard, so we call ourselves Saweda Harvard. But we, for the last 12 or 15 years, we've been going to China and to Taiwan, and we've been engaging in dialogues with various academics, think tank people, and government officials. I met Alan for the first time at the University of Oxford University. And I asked him to join the group, which he did for much of those 12 or 15 years. And so what I want to begin with is how he contributed to the group and how he contributed to our work. As Tom, I'm sure, is going to note, Alan's joining the group resulted in an immediate increase in the quality of our presentations. Not simply because Alan was making the presentations with us, but because Alan felt free to correct our presentations and with a certain intensity level and an occasional comment about academics. If any one thing, if any single thing characterized Alan's approach to the Taiwan question, it was that you had to get it right, that it had a language of its own, that it had an arcane and twisted logic of its own, and that you really had to command that logic and command that language before you even talk about it. And I think if you've read his book, Rein In at the Brink, you'll see in the introduction that the major point that he makes regarding why he wrote it was that he felt that the policymakers, but also academics, were consistently making errors or consistently presenting misleading arguments about the history and the substance of the relationship. So that's Alan, prime 1-1-1-1. Get it right and don't distort it. Secondly, there's no question that his connections and his reputation enhanced our visits. He seemingly knew every living American Foreign Service officer of any age. And his job was, as we visited, to arrange our embassy visits. And I can tell you that it was a good indication of his standing that we never failed to have embassy visits. But he also arranged foreign ministry visits and visits to small, unknown antique shops. So there was a newspaper article on the mainland a few years ago that tried to characterize our group. And it said that we had inxiang, we had influence. And of course, we all knew that that meant Alan. And that was sort of driven home to us when we met with President Tsai. And it was a picture of me talking to her. And the headline in the Chinese newspaper was that President Tsai meets with Rung Anlan and Deng Ren. And we, from that point on, wore Deng Ren. And so, like Snow White and the 7 Deng Rens, we would go around with Alan and introduce ourselves as part of Alan's delegation. Alan made other really vital contributions. We never missed an airplane. Alan insisted that we get to the airport at least 2 hours ahead of time. We got to know some of Asia's most uncomfortable airports very well, thanks to Alan. The second contribution was that we never left the hotel lobby until it was confirmed that the internet in the rooms worked, because you didn't want to be around Alan when he didn't have access to the internet. So we had wonderful internet service. Finally, the dress code of our group, again, we're sort of academics, we're a little scruffy. The dress code of our group was elevated by Alan's seemingly endless supply of pressed white shirts. And I only learned recently, or learned on a recent trip, that he was actually pressing them himself at night, while the rest of us were giving them to the hotel laundry. So soon after Alan joined the workshop, he began writing these commentaries for China Leadership Monitor. Alice Miller has written an introduction, I think, to the volume. Tom was Alan's predecessor, and I guess Tom will say something about that, with the China Leadership Monitor. But the China Leadership Monitor was something that Alice Miller came up with, at least 20 years ago, to fill a hole in American scholarship on China in regard to elite politics and Chinese politics on a continuing basis. That is, it was tracking developments in Chinese politics. About 3 times a year, it's invaluable for that function alone. But it became even more invaluable. I can't say that because Tom preceded him. Can you answer that? It became even more invaluable when Tom joined, when Alan joined it. It had been good before. It was okay. And Alan really created, and those volumes that you have are probably the most extensive tracking, the most extensive commentary on the Taiwan issue and cross-strait relations that exists in American academia, at least. The writings that Alan did for the China Leadership Monitor, though, were not simply trip reports. He did get a lot of his inspiration from our trips. He did get a lot of inspiration from the themes that we developed. But they were thoroughly researched academic papers, really, on the prevailing issues in cross-strait relationships. They form, I think, together. They form a chronicle, really, as I've said, of these very exciting years, really, in Taiwan politics and in cross-strait relations. They also form a resource for those who would want to go on and do further research on these questions. If you'll take a look when I've stopped talking, if you'll take a look at the publication itself, you'll see that it is almost equally footnotes as it is text. And Alan was determined that he was going to provide this extensive source for anyone who wanted to correct him, for anyone who wanted to follow up on these themes. And it led sometimes to conflicts with his editor. It certainly led to conflicts with me because he used to send me drafts and ask me to read them, and I refused to do the footnotes. They were just too many. But I think he got most of them right. it's the most valuable, one of the most valuable parts, really, of those writings. Running through the China Leadership Monitor pieces are a number of themes. The first theme, I think, again, is accuracy. The first theme is that it was important to get the story right, and Alan worked very hard to get the story right. Secondly, Alan was convinced that cross-strait relations were essentially a triangular relationship, and that you could really only understand them within the context of U.S. mainland Taiwan relations. Thirdly, to the extent that his analysis was prescriptive, he tried to avoid commenting on what the appropriate policy might be for the mainland or what the appropriate policy might be for Taiwan. But I don't think he was ever shy about talking about American policy. And of course, as we know, that was really his love. Fourthly, during the 12 years that he wrote these pieces, there were some dramatic swings in relationship across the strait, and as Tom's gray hairs will attest, in the relationship between Taiwan and the United States. And Alan, during those very dramatic swings, was neither excessively optimistic nor excessively pessimistic. His pessimism was always the result of, again, this conviction that he had that the issues were important issues of national interest, that they were complicated, and that even by both sides, they were often misunderstood. His optimism was the result of his sense that diplomacy could really solve anything, and that the consequences of not solving, the consequences of this cross-strait relationship going bad were so catastrophic that neither side would want to see that, and that both sides would strive to avoid it. So it was that optimism, belief in diplomacy, belief that both sides realized the consequences of letting this get out of hand, and a pessimism that was conditioned by his awareness of how important and vital to the national interest of all the players this issue was, that I think kept Alan on a steady course. Particularly during the Ma administration. If you look at the earlier set of those books that cover the Ma administration, you'll see in one of those introductions, Alan comments that one should not get overly optimistic about what was happening during the Ma administration. Remember, people were writing articles and talking about, the fact that Taiwan was about to float to the mainland, that Ma Ying-jeou was changing the configuration in Asia. And Alan writes in his introduction that one shouldn't go too far or too optimistic or become too optimistic in these developments. But he also cautions that there's a much rockier road ahead. He cautions that the low-hanging fruit, economic issues, are being solved, perhaps, but the real issues are the political issues. And he cautioned that the further the relationship moved, the more difficult it would become. And I think, just to end on maybe trying to pick up on that theme, when the last trip that Alan went on was in January of 2017. And it was right after Tsai Ing-wen had been elected president. And it was probably one of the most difficult and least productive meetings that we had on the mainland. The discussions were centering around or were reflecting a deep distrust of Tsai Ing-wen, a feeling that her election would intensify independence efforts by Taiwan. This is on the mainland. And equally, actually, distrust of American policy as supporting that drift. And Alan and I came away both, I think, pretty down about what had transpired. I spoke to him about a month before he died to report on the January 2018 trip. And we talked about the impression that we had earlier and how that impression now seemed to be becoming more intense. That in fact, it turned out that January of 2017 was the beginning of the end of a lull that the mainland had granted to Tsai Ing-wen. And the intervening year, there had been an intensification of the mainland's distrust of Tsai. And the best evidence of that distrust and that preoccupation with the dangers of independence, quote, quote, by the mainland was that by the second trip that we took, the mainland had explicitly introduced the sovereignty issue into cross-strait relations. In other words, who governs Taiwan? Who owns Taiwan? What is Taiwan in relationship to China? Now that's always been the lurking question, the question that has lurked underneath all of the economic negotiations, all of the apparent progress. And it was this concern with Tsai that seemed to have motivated the mainland to raise the sovereignty question, not as something to be solved in the future, not as something to be solved after a period of intermediary negotiations and agreements, but as a precondition for the continuation of cross-strait relations. In other words, what the mainland was saying was, before we get to have talks, you have to acknowledge the result. And that, of course, is not a trend that breeds optimism in cross-strait relations. And in the very brief conversation that Alan and I had, that was something that we both were concerned about. But it was also something that he had 2 or 3 ideas about how it could be circumvented. That I thought was equally Alan. So I can't think of any flourish to end this with. I think all of us, Tom and I, are both mini-me Allens, and where I am, at least, and I know Tom is, enormously indebted to him and appreciative of the relationship we had with him.
Thank you, Steve. So before turning over to Tom, let me say a few words about China Leadership Monitor. The publication that you see today in 3 volumes is actually all the Allen's contribution to China Leadership Monitor, which is edited by Alice Metter, my favorite professor when I was at SAIS, by the way. And actually, that's been done by Hoover Institution. So I'd like to acknowledge Dr. Michael Osling, Hoover Institution in DC office. They have a good representative in you, and thank you, Misha, for being with us. So with that, Tom.
Oh, thanks a lot, Yuki. Thanks to everyone for being here today. Really grateful that Nancy is here. I wanted to thank Pamela Kennedy as well, and Brian. And Brian reminded me that this is, I have to push this button, right? Brian reminded me that this is recorded, so I'm obliged to say that my views are just my own. I still advise the policy planning staff of the State Department and have since I left as Deputy Assistant Secretary in 2008. So I want to start with that. In late 2005, to my surprise, I was asked by the Bush administration to serve as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. And I had, for the previous several years, written for the China Leadership Monitor under Dr. Miller's leadership. And Dr. Miller at Stanford asked me, who should replace you if you can't write anymore? And I didn't hesitate for a moment, and I said Alan Romberg should write this piece. I also pointed out, and I wasn't being modest, that Alan should have been writing it all along. But Dr. Miller took that as modesty, but it was actually accurate. And it was accurate for a couple of reasons, because of all the qualities that Steve laid out about Alan. But there was another factor, which was I was a full-time academic. I was teaching classes. I was advising students. And it's actually pretty tough to produce those quarterly pieces if they're done well. You have to constantly read all these different newspapers, and you have to get all the subtleties of what's happening. You have to be able to separate the wheat from the chaff. And I realized when I recommended Alan that he does that every day. He did that every day just as a matter of course. So for him, it was really just an exercise in writing up what he was doing on a daily basis. For me, it was this huge struggle in addition to my day job. And I was really grateful for the struggle because when I went into the State Department, I was able to sort of hit the ground running and being up to speed on current affairs because of having to write this quarterly piece and have it be supported. So having traveled with Alan on the Harvard entourage, I knew that he was always up to speed. And I also knew, as Steve said, that the quality of that entourage increased greatly every time Alan was there, and for a few reasons. One was that he was more knowledgeable about government affairs than any of us. I had never served, Steve had never served, and the others hadn't served. And he was also just more on top of the subject matter, and he was very, very, very smart as an analyst. So someone asked me once, do you get nervous when you speak publicly? And I said, rarely. And they said, like, when? And I said, when I'm on a panel with Alan Romberg talking about Taiwan. If you're talking about Taiwan and Alan Romberg sitting next to you, you better be nervous. So he created a bar that made us all better, right? Maybe none of us were any good, but we were better than we otherwise would have been. So when I think of his essays, and Steve mentioned this, and it sounds like a kind of backhanded compliment. When I think of his essays, I think of the footnotes. And I really do encourage you to do what Steve encouraged you to do, which is go back and look at his China Leadership Monitor essays and look at the footnotes. Look how carefully they're done, how comprehensive they are, how he always had facts behind everything. And, I'm kind of an old school academic. Steve's just old. I'm an old school academic in that I took the traditional views of academia where if you make an argument and you ascribe views to people, come up with a footnote that shows that they actually think that way. Don't just make it up. And unfortunately, academia has spun out of control in this way. But if you look at Alan's standards were always much higher than any academic standard, old school or new school. You could disagree with his conclusions, and I sometimes did. I was never comfortable when I disagreed with Alan Romberg about cross-strait relations or about U.S.-Taiwan policy, but on occasion I did. It always made me uncomfortable. But the one thing you could never do, you could disagree with him, but you could never accuse him of having no basis for his argument. He always had facts on facts on facts. And I went back and I looked at one of the essays in preparation for this meeting. I looked at his October 2007 entry for the China Leadership Monitor. It was a particularly intense time. I was in the government. I was Deputy Assistant Secretary at the time. Particularly intense time in cross-Strait relations and in U.S.-Taiwan relations. And he wrote this brilliant essay that not only got what we were doing right, but offered the reasons. And that was right as well. And the essay is 24 single-spaced pages, which is a lot of verbiage, but it has 144 footnotes. Oh my God, 144 footnotes. So it just shows how careful and how smart he was. And I wanted to say something about policy. Just to, I think the best way to honor Alan is to try to do something like what he would do today if we were talking about cross-strait relations. So I thought I would talk a little bit about policy and some of the challenges that the United States faces and that Taiwan faces and cross-strait relations face in the future. And 2007 to 2008, I would say, were the last time that cross-strait relations were really tense, where there was a danger of conflict across the Taiwan Strait. And in the years under President Ma, cross-strait relations improved greatly. Since the election of President Tsai, they've become more chilly. But unlike President Chun, President Tsai has been a very moderate advocate of her party's position on cross-strait relations. She has avoided provocations. I personally think she has been a very fine leader. She has taken a very careful road, a very prudent road in forwarding Taiwan's interests. She's avoided some of the provocative slogans, the one country on each side of the strait. She's accepted the existing constitution of the Republic of China as her basis of power. And she's not yet pursued any provocative referenda asserting Taiwan's sovereignty separate from the mainland. So the problem really in cross-strait relations has been the mainland's insistence that President Tsai parrot the phraseology of the predecessor, President Ma, this so-called 1992 consensus, and the mainland's stubborn refusal to deal with President Tsai's administration in a direct, high-level fashion until she does. The mainland's applied military, economic, and diplomatic pressure against Taiwan in ways that were avoided during President Ma's presidency. And the balance of power across the Taiwan Strait has grown even more lopsided in the favor of the mainland in the ensuing years. But what concerns me is not this year, not the present. What concerns me is 2020. I wanted to say something about 2020 and why I'm concerned about it. I think it promises or portends to be an eventful year in cross-strait relations. Eventful years are not always good years, but I think it pretends to be an eventful year. And I'm a little bit concerned that Taiwan may not be fully prepared militarily to deter the mainland's potential use of some sort of force against Taiwan in a coercive way in that year. So why 2020? One of the things that Alan and I always agreed upon when we were doing the kind of analysis we did for China Leadership Monitor is that one of the key factors in cross-strait stability is the degree of optimism or pessimism on the mainland about trends in Taiwan and trends in cross-strait relations and trends in U.S.-Taiwan relations. That was a major driver of how the mainland behaved toward Taiwan. And you would think that given trends in the region that mainland China would have reasons to be supremely confident about trends, that it's getting richer, it's getting more powerful. The economic dependence on the mainland for Taiwan is quite evident, and more young, skilled Taiwan citizens are going to the mainland not only for jobs but also for education. So there's a real concern on the island about that kind of sucking sound from the mainland. The mainland has stripped away a few more of Taiwan's remaining diplomatic partners. And President Tsai's popularity ratings in Taiwan are not very high. So you would think that they would be relatively confident. But I don't think they are, and I think they realize that they have failed miserably in one persistent fashion, and is that they've failed miserably to win over the hearts and minds of the Taiwan public. Despite all the economic interaction, despite all the attractions of places like Shanghai, they've failed to win over the hearts and minds of the Taiwan public. And when President Ma, who was quite moderate toward the mainland, quite accommodating toward the mainland, left office, his popularity rating was only 9%. That's very difficult to establish, such a low popularity rating. And one of the main reasons was his accommodating posture towards the mainland. It wasn't the only reason, but it was one of the main reasons. And while President Tsai's popularity ratings are low, they're quite likely higher than any potential KMT candidate who might run against her in 2020. And it's a competition. So my students say, well, her popularity rating's very low. And I said, she only has to have higher popularity ratings than her opponent. She doesn't have to be, the most popular leader ever to win in a Democratic race. So the question that I have about 2020 is, will the KMT stick to its traditional one China policy in the 2020 election? It's a losing bet. It is a competitive environment. So if they do and they get trounced, I think the KMT gets trounced in the election because it sticks to the one China plank of its platform, the mainland will be very upset with the outcome of that election because it'll look like a reasonable position from their point of view, and it'll be extremely unpopular in Taiwan. The other thing they could do is abandon it. And I think that would create huge shockwaves on the mainland. If no major party in Taiwan was actively advocating a one China position, that would be a big shock to the mainland. And their trend analysis would go haywire, I think, in terms of pessimism. A third option is the KMT could be very mealy-mouthed about one China. They could sort of seem like they had the traditional position but not really say it. And under those circumstances, what concerns me is in a competitive electoral system, the DPP would have strong incentives to hold the KMT's feet to the fire on the issue by making themselves distinct from the one China position and therefore taking a less moderate position on cross-strait relations than President Tsai has managed to take since she took office. So the electoral cycle could make the DPP more green, especially if the KMT starts to waffle on its deep blue foundations. So I worry about all of those things, and I think 2020 could be a difficult year on that front. And on the military front, I think there's good news and bad news. I'm a little bit more sanguine about Taiwan's military security than some of my colleagues. I recognize mainland China's impressive military modernization, the fact that they have a lot more options than they've had in the past to coerce or attack Taiwan. But I guess I see it like this, that what Taiwan needs to establish is not a balance of power across the Taiwan Strait. It needs to establish enough military power that it will be very, very costly for the mainland to use force against Taiwan. It's an asymmetric strategy that's needed. Basically, Beijing's leaders need never to think that today is the day that I want to risk a lot to resolve differences across the Taiwan Strait through military force. And if every day is a day like that, Taiwan will be okay. As long as Taiwan doesn't, in the process, provoke an attack from the mainland, where the mainland leaders don't feel like they have any choice but to use force. So I think there's a possibility of a successful asymmetric approach to defense. I think it's arduous, it's expensive, and it takes a very serious set of thoughts about defense. And I think my impression is that many Taiwan elites in both the KMT and the DPP understand this, and that's encouraging. That's the good news. The bad news is there's still a remnant tendency in both major parties in Taiwan, in my opinion, to want to spend large amounts of money on flashy military equipment that they would acquire from the United States. This has political meaning. It shows the United States loves Taiwan, shows that the leaders are able to manage the United States. I don't think that's necessarily the best way, and in many cases is not the best way. It's a negative factor for Taiwan's defense, because some of the things that Taiwan needs to do are not that sexy, they're not that expensive. They are important, and they will take the attention to be focused on those issues. The last thing that concerns me is the move to an all-volunteer force. And this was not a policy, and my impression is it's not a policy of the Tsai administration. It was something they inherited from the Ma administration as a kind of parting gift of the Ma administration was to offer the abolition of the draft force for the Taiwan military. I see this as a really big problem because I think what it's going to result in is a smaller military that's more expensive, which in the 2x2 table on an asymmetric strategy world is the worst outcome. You have a more professional, maybe more skilled person for person, but it's quite expensive to keep them, and you get a smaller force. And I don't think that that's consistent with the kind of asymmetric strategies that Taiwan needs to have. So my hope is that this will be seen in Taiwan as an experiment. Obviously, I hope I'm wrong, and I hope that the all-volunteer force, when it's fully implemented, works out great, and Taiwan's defense is robust, and they are able to deter mainland aggression. But if I am wrong, if I'm not wrong, I hope that it's viewed in Taiwan as an experiment, and they can go back to the traditional manner of raising troops in the future. Because I do take very, very seriously China's military modernization, and I take very seriously some of the factors that Steve laid out that he learned with Alan in the mainland about their concerns about trends in Taiwan politics. And at the end of the day, a lot of this is just politics. It's not really military, it's not really economic, it's politics. And the last thing I'll say about Alan is Alan was a stickler for words. He was a spokesperson, and he was a great choice for a spokesperson because he was a stickler for words. And for all the people out there who study cross-strait relations, study how Alan studied words. Because cross-strait relations is really about politics, but it's really about identity politics. It's really about what it means to be a citizen in Taiwan and what it means to be a citizen of the PRC or a leader of the PRC or a leader of Taiwan. So the words that leaders choose and the words that commentators choose are very, very important in cross-strait relations. And Alan set a standard for studying those types of topics and doing it carefully and rigorously. And I think you should all follow his model. I tried to the best of my ability. But I was right when I said to Dr. Miller, you should have had Alan all along, so this is a no-brainer. And he proved that in spades, and my ego survived. but he was a great choice, and he did a great job. And I really encourage you to look at the books that have been produced so professionally by Yuki and her colleagues.
Thank you, Tom. When he talked about Alan being a stickler or precise about words, I saw more than several heads going up and down in the audience. I guess everybody had the recipient of Alan's guidance on that one, more than a few occasions. I have so much questioning because I learned so much from both of you, but instead of me indulging that, I'll just open up to the floor. So we have an academic with a deep background in China, but then you can also who can also talk about the very robust conversation about today's policy issues. So open the floor. Chris, go ahead.
Thanks, Chris Nelson, Nelson Report, and like almost everybody here, a continued beneficiary of Alan. You know, as you know, I put out something almost every day, and if it had something about that interested Alan, by God, I heard about it really quickly, and it wasn't just spell check, although there was that too. So he was just fabulous. And it goes back to I was the junior staffer on the Taiwan Relations Act, so he always expected me to actually remember, you know, the stuff that he had right there at his fingertips, and he kept saying, you know, you did read my book, right? Yes, I did. Anyway, question. Steve, you said that in your last conversation with Alan, he actually had some ideas about how to avoid some of the pitfalls that Tom has done such a really great job of scaring us and reminding us of. Do any of them come to mind, or last bit of wisdom from Alan you could share with us? Thanks.
Well, no. What I can say is that they were alternatives to this formulation, this 1992 consensus that the mainland was insisting on as a prerequisite for talks. And he was, and had been really, maybe in his last leadership monitor, he had been thinking he had been thinking of possible ideas in that regard. The problem is that he was aware, and I think we're all aware, who have followed this of the fact that with the election of Tsai Ing-wen, the Chinese moved the goalposts on the 1992 consensus. That is, they began very explicitly to say that the 1992 consensus was a mutual agreement to accept the one China principle. And the one China principle, of course, is that Taiwan is a part of China. They added another phrase, which is end to oppose independence. Now, during Mine Zhou, who defined the 1992 consensus as an agreement to disagree, in other words, different interpretations of one China, the mainland never specifically criticized that, but they never repeated it. So there was this slight shift, slight hardening that really made alternatives to an acceptable Chinese formulation very few, if that makes sense.
You have additional thought on that, Tom? Or?
No.
Dennis, good to see you.
Yes. Hello, I'm Dennis Halpin. I was at the U.S. Korea Institute till it closed the end of the month. I consult for the TECRO and the South Koreans on occasion. Professor Christensen, nice to see you again. I had a really important question for you. I agree with what you said about concerns about an all-volunteer army for Taiwan. Both it becomes more professional but more expensive. South Korea is inching in that same direction. But my question is the United States, and you work with young people at the university. The U.S. has been able, post-Vietnam, to conduct wars in the Middle East, Central America, South Asia, with an all-volunteer army. But another major war in Europe, if Putin did something, or in Asia with China, and flashpoints with China could be the Taiwan Strait, the South China Sea, or even the Korean Peninsula if suddenly Kim Jong-un becomes Rocket Man again. My question to you is the same concern you raised about Taiwan. Do you think if the United States, and God hope, I mean, my son was just, he's in the reserves. He just spent a month deployed in Korea, so I don't want a war in Asia. But if this confrontation took place over Taiwan in 2020, or on the Korean Peninsula or South China Sea, do you think the United States, with the same problems of a professional, more professional, but more costly armed forces, could we fight a major war in Asia without a return to the draft? When I left Congress, Charlie Rangel was saying we might need to have a draft back because he was a Korean War veteran. So does America have the same problem as Taiwan or not?
I'm not an expert on America.
But we live here.
I just live here. I think I'm a New Yorker, so I'm pretty familiar with Congressman Rangel's views on these things. He was a hero of the Korean War. I always thought his views about it were more of a sociological position, that the military's become too divorced from mainstream society, and that when people commit forces to the field, they should realize that their own kids, as in your case, God bless your son for serving, that people should think about wars as things that could impact their own families. I always thought that that was his position on reinstating the draft. I don't think it was necessarily a position about the shortage of American soldiers or the need for surge capacity if you have a conflict with a major power. And if you think about surge capacity, if we had a conflict with China, God forbid, over Taiwan or some other matter in the maritime sphere, it would take a long time to train up conscripts to get them into the fight. So one would hope that that conflict would be long over before the first 19-year-olds who were drafted would be ready to actually join the fight. Otherwise, we'd be in big trouble. So I think the United States is different than Taiwan in the following sense. The United States has technological superiority over other military foes. It has a highly trained and a very large professional force. And it is stronger than its potential adversaries. In the case of Taiwan, I think that they have a different problem. They're faced with a much larger adversary, and the types of methods that they can adopt to try to deter that much larger adversary are very different than the challenges that face U.S. power projection forces around the world. So I don't really see the analogy. I understand Representative Rangel's arguments, and I respect them, and I don't have a leg to stand on to really criticize them, because I think they come out of his personal experience, having served in Korea and almost dying in Korea, and the esprit de corps that he had coming out of that experience. So I'll just say I respect his position, but I don't think it's driven by the particular concerns that you raise.
Ben?
Thank you, Yuki. I'm Ben Self. I was 19 years ago the holder of Yuki's position as a Japan senior associate. And I had the strange, as an early 30s senior associate here, the strange experience of interviewing Alan Romberg for the job that we eventually hired him for. And Michael Crepon was president.
Excellent work.
It wasn't easy, actually, although you'd think it would be obvious. Randy Shriver was the other candidate.
Oh, wow.
And at the time, President Michael Crepon was saying, well, Randy's got a bright future and a lot of energy. You know, Alan's kind of washed up.
What?
And Cheryl and I argued, we need Alan Romberg here, and we prevailed, and I was probably the biggest beneficiary doing my Japan work and Japan-China relations work, benefiting from his guidance and insight and wordsmithing, precision on the spokesman's work. So incredible, and I'm so grateful for that, and for you here today talking about him. I wanted to ask a question along the lines of what I think he might be able to answer for me, which is to talk about Chinese use of language and Chinese use of the term core national interest. And I think he would help me understand when the Chinese add South China Sea to their enumerated list, along with Xinjiang and Taiwan, as one of their core national interests, which means hands off, U.S., don't bother us. What are we to do to respond to that rhetorical change, that expansion on China's part of what it demands that we respect?
It's a good question. I mean, to channel my inner Alan Romberg, I'd say that there is a series of misconceptions about when or if that change actually occurred in the South China Sea. So it had to do with meetings between State Councilor Dai Bingguo and American officials. It wasn't clear whether it was called core national interest or whether the statement was it touches upon core national interest, which would be sovereignty, and Shujida. It's complicated, but this is the kind of thing he would study. And but regardless of whether they claim it's core national interest or then not claim core national interest, my take on all of that is it's a problem for American foreign policy. And the problem in the Obama administration is that they accepted that term, core national interests, and created an agreement in 2009, a joint statement saying that we would have mutual respect for core national interests. I think that was a mistake. I had great respect for the people involved in the Obama administration at the time, friends of lots of people in this room. I think they made a mistake, and I think they realized it was a mistake because you'll see, if you track the wording, like Alan would have done, or did, they stopped using it. You didn't see the U.S. government using core national interests after that late 2009 episode. And the reason is a simple one. When Dai Bingguo, the state counselor, elaborated China's core national interests in Washington and elsewhere, it was very clear what they were. First and foremost, it's the continued single-party rule of the Chinese Communist Party. Second, it's territorial sovereignty. And third, it's It's an environment that's conducive to economic development. Now, the United States government really only agrees with the third of those three. We would like to see China have an environment that is conducive to economic development. We don't agree on China's map, right? Both physically and in interpretation. And we don't agree that the Chinese Communist Party should rule forever. So why say that we have this agreement on core national interest? So I would just say they can claim anything they want about the South China Sea, whether it is or isn't in the core national interest. We should just sail and fly where international law allows, and we should do it quietly. These freedom of navigation operations are the least provocative military operations you've ever seen. And we should just do it regularly, and we should not brag about it. So unfortunately, for a while, we were doing them rarely and then making them sound like they were great big muscle movements, and that's the worst thing you could do. The whole point of them is that they're regular, that they're just regular things to do. They're not extraordinary in any way. You're just asserting your right to do something that's legal. Now, I'm hopeful that that will work. Even with the artificial islands, which I think are provocative and destabilizing, I don't expect the Chinese leaders to be so aggressive as to start firing on the U.S. Navy or on our aircraft. I just don't expect that to happen.
First Michael Ponte, and then I'll get to you.
Mike Ponte, I'm the director of the DPP's mission here in Washington. Thanks for a great presentation. Tom, you and I were operating there in 2007 when things were
Dennis
bumpy.
too, on the hill. Dennis was on the hill,
That's
right?
true. I just came back from Taiwan, met with the president. I think she's committed, as you already said, to this very centrist position of maintaining the status quo. She's getting pushed around by both domestic people and, of course, by the Chinese. I think she'll stick to that as far as possible. The problem is she needs some support every once in a while, and I think that's where instead of getting caught in a downward spiral in that case, I think more presence by the United States would be helpful. Cabinet-level visits, for example, or arms sales. I wonder if you had any thoughts on that, how to break the downward spiral by the United States.
Okay, is there a downward spiral? I don't know if there's a downward spiral. I support arms sales that are in Taiwan's defense interests. If they strengthen Taiwan's defense, I'm all for them. I've always advocated such positions. And I note that when things were really tense between Taiwan and the United States in the 07-08 period, we went right along and kept selling weapons. And we sold a big tranche in September 2007. So while people in Taiwan were screaming at us for our position against the UN referendum, people on the mainland were screaming at us for selling weapons to Taiwan at a sensitive time. And our response was, it's always a sensitive time for you guys. You know, they have to have defensive capabilities, and we're going to sell them. It's always a sensitive time. And no, it's not a signal of anything. If there's any proof that it's not a signal of anything, look at what we're saying about what we see as assertions of unilateral change to the status quo. So I think President Tsai has been quite moderate, quite strategic. I'm not surprised by that. I've known her a long time. Steve's known her a long time. I think she's a very, very smart, very capable leader. And I was kind of upset about the U.S. criticism of her way back in 2012 on a sort of personal level that you heard in high-level commentary. So I'm not surprised that she's taken a moderate and strategic position. I do think Taiwan needs to strengthen its defenses in various ways. I'm not really at liberty to go into all the ways I think Taiwan should strengthen its defenses because I still consult for their Pacific Command and I want to keep the lines clear. But you get a sense of what I mean is that it should be very costly for the mainland to use force against Taiwan. And part of that is military. Part of that is preparing for, say, a blockade by having better reserves of strategic materials. Taiwan needs to be able to outlast a conflict as well. And I think they could strengthen their security situation in that way as well. So in terms of support, I hear a lot about high-level visits. I attended the AIT. We were there together at the AIT opening up in Taipei last week. It was a great event. Kin Moy's a terrific diplomat, and he did a great job. All around, I think it was a success. And I think it was sincere that it was a sign I had been at the last meetings that fought for the funding for that building. It's a U.S. government, so China builds a major city, the U.S. government builds one building in 10 years. So 10 years later, the building comes to fruition, and it was great to see it. But I often hear that we need higher level meetings between U.S. officials and Taiwan officials for better contact. And, I suffered through the protocols and having to leave the State Department building to meet my Taiwan counterparts, and others in this room have done the same. But I never really bought the argument that we don't have good channels of communication with Taiwan. There's no ambassador around the world who sees the president as often as the AIT director sees the president of Taiwan. It's just, it's a common thing. It's not that common. Even in the UK, the US ambassador is not just always hanging around with the prime minister, right? And so I think we have very good communication channels. The problem is we don't always agree. And then what gets blamed are the communication channels. And if I thought it was really important for an undersecretary of state to go to Taiwan to discuss some pressing matter and only that person could really handle the discussions, I would be for it. But I find it a little bit hard to imagine what that issue would be. So then why are you doing it? If you're just doing it to show the love, I think it's probably not a great idea. Because it will lead to a reaction. Right? So is it worth it? So that's always the question. I'm very pragmatic. Is it worth it for a 3-star general to go to Taiwan as opposed to a colonel? Is it worth it for a DAS to go instead of a Taiwan Coordination Office director to have a discussion? And if the answer is yes for some specific reason, then I think it should be allowed. But what worries me is when Congress weighs in and says, you should have higher level meetings and we expect them to happen. I think that puts the executive branch in a difficult position. Because for very good reasons based in American democracy, the executive branch has great respect for the legislative branch, and it has to because they hold the purse strings. On the other hand, there's not an easy answer to that practical question that I raise. So you don't want people to be sent just for show, because show can cause trouble and actually produce not very positive results. I should say that I thought Assistant Secretary Royce did a fantastic job representing the United States at the AIT opening. I think she did a great job. She struck just the right tone, and she was great. I told her that on the plane too. We flew out together. So, I think she did a great job. And I don't think the sky's going to collapse because there was an Assistant Secretary of State there.
So, gentleman in the back, he gets the last question.
Thank you. Ping Liu of Mirror Media. I remember Alan Romberg visited Taiwan around 10 years ago. I'm pretty sure Dr. Christensen was not among the group because you were the senior government official of the United States.
I was under restrictions.
Yeah, and maybe Dr. Goldstein was among that trip. And they were asked by President Chen Shui-bian, and are you blue team or you red team? That means are you pro-China or pro-Taiwan? And Alan answered, Mr. President, we are red team, and we are blue team, and we are white team, because we are American.
Yeah.
So my question, that means that they do care the interest of the United States. So my question is, you just answered part of my question to Michael Fonte. My question is, what is the U.S. interest in Taiwan? Or I should ask in detail. You said U.S. should do this. Maybe it happens to be today happens to be the Korean War anniversary. And
it is, yeah, right.
Yes. And in June 27th, 1950, President Truman sent 7th Fleet to cruise Taiwan, and it stabilized the Taiwan Strait. And my question is, in detail, do you think U.S. should or would, if would, how soon, send maybe warship to visit Taiwan, port visit, or to have U.S. soldiers join Taiwan's military exercise, or invite Taiwan to join U.S. Pacific exercise, or U.S. should do something else to help Taiwan to strengthen its military defense, such like F-35 airplane sold to Taiwan?
Wow.
Thank you.
So in response, I think I would like to turn to both of you to have any concluding thoughts that you have on your mind. So
you want to say what?
Point of order.
It's up to you.
It was State Roy who did the red, white, and blue, because I had coffee with him right afterwards.
Who is sitting right there? Thank you, Professor Roy.
He should get credit for that line. I really have nothing.
Turn on your mic. What's the American interest in Taiwan? Come on, you have an opinion on that.
Oh, come on, we can all do that off the back of our heads. I think what I would say, as sort of a final, and Tom's usually the pessimist.
It's my job.
I join Tom with his pessimism. I think that the cross-strait relations are badly stalemated. That each side now is taking its position, which each side views as non-negotiable, and there seems to be no willingness, or on the part of Taiwan, political ability due to public opinion. On the mainland, no willingness on the part of the leadership to explore any possible compromises at the moment. So I think things are serious. I agree with Tom. And they are contingent primarily upon caution on the Taiwan side and patience on the mainland side, because caution on the Taiwan side is not the result that the mainland would like to see, and so they have to be patient and learn to live with the status quo. So it's very hard to see at the moment any possible compromise. And as Tom said, Chinese policy today is very contradictory, because they do talk about winning the hearts and minds of the Taiwan people. They do offer youths all kinds of incentives, companies all kinds of incentives to come to the mainland. And yet, on the other hand, they pressure Taiwan in all of the ways that we know. So it's difficult to see how that's winning the hearts and minds. They're pursuing two contradictory and almost canceling policies.
I just say, in American political debates about Taiwan policy, I think that there's a very, very broad consensus that everyone loves Taiwan. There's very few people who are anti-Taiwan. There are very few people in the United States who are pro-mainland, especially when it comes to Taiwan. But there are huge differences of opinion about how the United States should pursue its relationship with Taiwan in a way that expresses that love for Taiwan. And the way I put it with my students, and sometimes with my colleagues, and sometimes with my colleagues when I was in the government, is some of us want to love Taiwan to death. Because they're not careful in how they love Taiwan. They're not thoughtful in how they love Taiwan. They want to express the love, but they don't think about the strategic implications of the ways that Americans express love for Taiwan, and how that can actually cause a catastrophe for Taiwan in the process. So you raised a long raft of potential U.S. policies towards Taiwan, which shows how on top of the issues you are. I don't know which ones to address in specific. You mentioned advanced aircraft. Most countries want advanced aircraft. Most militaries want advanced aircraft. I'm not entirely certain that at this point in history, given the challenges posed by mainland equipment and training, that advanced aircraft is the best expenditure of Taiwan dollars for defense. I'll just raise it in that kind of abstract way. They're expensive, they're hard to train with, and unfortunately, even some of the American advanced aircraft can be shot down and can also be hit on the ground. So it may not be the best investment for Taiwan. And I say that wanting Taiwan to be strong and have a strong deterrent, not because I want to deprive Taiwan of something. Well, I think we have to think hard about what will make Taiwan strong and what will make Taiwan safe. Port visits, I don't get. U.S. Navy port visits in Taiwan ports, why? To show we love Taiwan? Don't we show that all the time? It doesn't provide any military advantage to have U.S. ships go in and out of Taiwan ports. I say on the margins, it increases the likelihood of a crisis and a conflict, and therefore it's not worth it. If I thought that there was some pressing military need for an American ship to pull into Kaohsiung and pull out of Kaohsiung, we have Navy veterans here like Doug Paul, and maybe he could explain to me why that's so important. I don't see that that's where the fight's going to be for the U.S. Navy if it ever were to come to Taiwan's defense, and I just don't get it. It's purely symbolic. It's symbolic in a way that will almost certainly lead to some negative reaction, if not the use of force, some negative reaction on the mainland that will make Taiwan's security situation worse, not better. And so I say I'm against it. But I'm willing to entertain anything, short of, say, nuclear weapons. I don't want. But you asked a very abstract question, and there was a famous story. I think it's Mike Mansfield was the subject of the story. Secretary Shultz, when he was Secretary of State, used to ask the diplomats who came in to find the country, their country on the globe in his office. Ambassador Mansfield went in. He was about to head off to Japan, and Secretary Shultz said, "Show me your country on the globe." And he spun it around. He found the United States, and he put his finger right in the middle of the United States. He said, "That's my country." And I gather that's what Stape was saying with red, white, and blue, that we're red, white, and blue, this team. So we have differences of opinion about how to pursue U.S. national interests, but I think the U.S. has a very strong national interest in the future of Taiwan, both for its own sake, because Taiwan is not an issue, it's not a question, it's not a problem, it's a miracle. It's 23 million successful people who built a democracy, a wealthy economy, great education system. It's a miracle, and it should be protected. Have a huge stake in Taiwan being a model for the region, and it has been a model for the region, and other places have gone through transformations that have been positive. Mainland China says that multi-party democracy is a Western concept and Westernization is occurring, but China is surrounded by successful multi-party democracies that are Asian, including Taiwan, which is not a Western society by any stretch of the imagination, nor should it be. Nor is Japan, nor is South Korea, nor is India, nor is Indonesia. Right? So it's a living example of the wrong-headedness of that argument for authoritarianism. And then the last thing is how cross-strait relations play out will say a lot about the future of China. And if China is able to coerce its way to getting its way with Taiwan against Taiwan's will, that will be terrible for Taiwan, but it'll also be very bad for China. And the China we have to deal with that is successful in doing that will be a much more difficult China to deal with than a China that uses more peaceful means, convincing means, negotiations, trade, etc., to try to influence Taiwan. So I think we have an enormous stake, national interest stake, in Taiwan's well-being and security. And I don't think we have a huge stake in Taiwan's sovereignty. I don't think we have a huge stake in expressions of hostility towards China, mainland China, in Taiwan. I think we have a stake in Taiwan's security and its prosperity and its ability of the Taiwan people to determine their own political governance. And I think the United States has done a pretty good job of that across administrations. And it pains me that the current narrative in Washington seems to be that somehow the U.S. one-China policy was misguided and has failed. And I think you can just point to Taiwan and the success that Taiwan is today to show that that is a false argument. And I think Alan would have said that. if he were here. So I think it's a good note to end on. I appreciate your question. I hope I answered it thoroughly. Can't go into all the details about each weapon system, but thank you for it.
Thank you, you both. And if you can join me in thanking Steve and Tom for their time and their reflection on Alan and more, so much more, I should say.
Thank you, Yuki.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Hey, Dave. Good to see you again.
Good to see you. Really terrific comments by both.
Thank you.
I was thinking as you all were running through this, I worked very closely with Alan back on the normalization papers.
Right.
A lot of people forget that he was a principal author of the normalization symposium. And
that's right.
He not only helped shepherd the Taiwan relations along. Alan was the consummate nitpicker, but that's the wrong way of putting it. Because Alan had something that is rare in government. He attached enormous importance to detail.
Yes.
And the U.S.-China relationship, detail was really important.
Yeah.
And Alan deserves a lot of credit for the fact that when we made a commitment and used particular language, there was a reason for that, and you needed to know what the reason was.
And he appreciated that, yeah.
There's not a single person in the U.S. government now who has a clue of the importance of that language.
Yeah.
Not a single person.
You're right. You're right. Yeah.
And therefore
Yeah.
they think that we have what we want.